Once again, welcome to St. Peter the Apostle Anglican Church in Kingsport, Tennessee. We're continuing with our study of Anglicanism 101, or what is Anglicanism, after a brief 2-week hiatus due to the flu that just about took everybody out. Just a brief overview. We discussed at the beginning how you approach this question. It breaks down into 3 different categories. You can go back into the lectures. They're online to get a sense of that. Additionally, we talked about the very early state of Christianity in Great Britain. It was very cursory in how we discussed what was going on. And what we're going to do today, and probably over the next couple of weeks, we're going to do some filling in. It's not going to be detailed, but what I want to do is just provide some hooks so that as you consider the state of Christianity throughout the world, but I keep moving out of this lens here, but particularly within the UK, you will have a sense as to how Christianity developed in the early church, which will contribute to informing our understanding of the relationship between Christianity and, most specifically, Rome. Because we constantly hear the refrain that Anglicanism is simply a break off of Rome. And as we go through this morning and the next couple of weeks, we're going to see that that's actually not correct, that there was a specific Anglican identity prior to Rome arriving on the scene. So what we're going to do is we're just going to hit some highlights as we walk through this to give us some sinew, kind of connect the muscles and the tissues here. The first thing that we see when we start talking about Christianity in Great Britain is the legends that arose around the state of Christianity, how Christianity was formed, what influenced Christianity in the early years of Christianity in Great Britain. We hear of the legends of St. Paul arriving in the UK, or Philip, if we remember Philip from Acts, where he was moved by the Spirit miraculously to get to the Ethiopian. Well, apparently, according to some legends, his teleportation to Ethiopia wasn't limited to North Africa. It wound up taking him to the UK. And of course, the single most famous legend that we encounter when we talk about early Christianity is what? Come on, all of you Anglophiles. Joseph of Arimathea and the Virgin Mary showing up, founding a church in Glastonbury, and of course, then that contributes to thousands of years of the Grail lore. And so many books, and so many wasted dead trees. It is virtually unsubstantiated, and that yet we will have people, I have some good friends, that will literally go to the stake believing that Joseph of Arimathea and the Virgin Mary somehow took a ship from Jerusalem and wound up in the UK. I'll leave that to you. AD 200 becomes significant because this was by the way, in case you're wondering, the majority of this information comes from John Mormon's The History of the Church in England. Not all of it, but the majority of it, so that you can reference that. AD 200 becomes significant because it is the first time that we find a mention of Christianity in Great Britain in writing. Tertullian speaks of in a tract against the Jews, because Tertullian was pretty much against everybody, and he writes around 200 AD, where he mentions that there are areas of Great Britain that were inaccessible or unaccessible to the Roman army, and he uses the phrase "as yet." So many people, most scholars will say that because Tertullian said that as yet there are unconquered areas of Great Britain, the implication is that there are areas that had been conquered. So those are the areas in which we find Christianity being disseminated throughout the Isle. About 40 years later, Origen writes that Christianity in the Isles is one of the locations where we can see a representation of the teaching of Christ. And Origen becomes a controversial figure on many counts, but he writes literally about half a century after Tertullian makes his statement. Now, we get to the 3rd century, and for the most part, there is a sense of calm, a peace that kind of settles over Christianity, even though we have the Dacian and the Valerian persecutions between the middle of the 3rd century, 249 to 260. But generally speaking, when we get to the 300s and we get to the 4th century, things start to calm down, not the least of which is because of Constantine becoming the emperor, issuing the Edict of Milan. And that in and of itself provides some information for us, because what happened there, and we might get into it a little bit later, but what happened there was Constantine, in an attempt to apologize to the church for the persecutions that the church had undergone for the first 300 years of her existence, essentially took the basilicas away from the patricians and gave it to the church. So when you look at the physical structure of most of our churches from 300 to, well, through the Middle Ages, what you see is an architectural structure that's based upon the basilica concept that was evident throughout almost all of patrician homes. So when you see in the early church altars or tables moved away, it's because that's the way the basilicas were designed. You had the large area, you had wings, and then you had this loop. We call it an asp, not an asp. It is an asp.
Apse.
Apse. That's it. I get the S and the P always reversed. We have the apse in the front. That later changes as the theology changes, but it was during Constantine's reign that occurred. Anyway, so there's this relative peace in the 300s, and then what we see that this is not the first mention, but it's one of the first prominent mentions of British bishops making an appearance. They show up at the Council of Arles, and these are their names. I almost want to ask you guys to pronounce them, but no, I won't. There's Bishop Eborius of York, and this one is my favorite, Bishop Restitutus of London, and that actually, this is going to become significant in maybe not next week, but the week after, when we start talking about how the regions were broken down ecclesiastically. And then there's Bishop Adelphius of Colchester. So these are the individuals that are specifically named as bishops of the UK arriving in the Council of Arles. Now, we know, as we mentioned briefly, I believe, a couple of weeks ago, that even though we did not have an Anglican representation at the Council of Nicaea, we had a document of affirmation that was communicated to the council in support of Athanasius. So even though we weren't there, we were on the side of orthodoxy. Now, the first recorded name, which predates this just a little bit, of a British Christian was Saint Alban. He's mentioned by Bede. He was a layman, and he was in the Roman city of, I love this, Verulamium. Sounds like a Barca lounge in somebody's living room. But he gave, St. Alban gave refuge to a Christian priest who was fleeing persecution. And while hiding this particular priest, and I also want you to note, and this is important, that the name priest is constantly used. Priest, not presbyter, priest. And you can read my book to hear my argument about that, about the linguistic problem. But anyway, so he hides this priest, and St. Alban was converted. When the Roman soldiers arrived to arrest this particular priest, St. Alban took the priest's garments, wore them, continued to hide the priest, gave himself up in the place of the priest, and was eventually condemned and martyred. And on the place where he was executed, we have one of the most famous British churches that still is in existence today, St. Albans. Now, the date of these events roughly corresponds with the Diocletian persecution somewhere in the early 300s. Some people identify it specifically around 304, but just consider the early 300s. We talked about the Edict of Milan. Once again, we get to AD 359, and there is another council, Council of Rimini. Now, one of the things I want you to keep in mind is that when we speak of councils generally, especially within ecclesiastical circles, we usually speak of the major councils. We speak of Nicaea, we speak of Chalcedon, we speak of Ephesus, we speak of the major councils. There were regional councils that were springing up like weeds for the first 300 years of the church. And what we see in AD 359 is the Council of Rimini.
Where?
Rimini, R-I-M-I-N-I. And British bishops were in attendance. Now, another anecdotal, or I shouldn't say anecdotal, but tangential point to make at this point. Now, we've already gone from the 300s. Now, if you understand how ecclesiology functions and how churches and organizations develop, bishops don't spring up overnight, especially in an area such as Great Britain, which was a diverse ethnic and cultural region. Primarily, the Anglo-Saxons had dominance, and we talked about how it all broke down and how the various kingdoms competed with one another. But generally speaking, it was the Anglo-Saxons. The predominant religion or mindset was the German Norse gods. Woden was the big man on campus. So when we start to talk about the development of Christianity, in Great Britain, we have to realize it takes time to get to a point where you have this type of organization in place. So when we see Tertullian speaking of Christianity, one of the things that Tertullian wrote in response to basically Gnostics, but heretics in general, was a refutation of their position based upon their lack of apostolic succession. And one of the most famous quotes of Tertullian was, and I'm paraphrasing, "You guys claim that you have authority, that you can speak for the church. Well, you show us your list of bishops. We'll show you our list of bishops. We have the names of all of our bishops." And if you go into Bede and you read the Venerable Bede, he actually lists the names of all the bishops from the first century. But the point of that is this. The concept of the organization of episcopacy was already in place in Great Britain. It didn't need any quote-unquote outside religious influence to form bishops. And we see that by the time we get to the 300s, we have bishops already representing regions. We already have them representing, which means that years and years before that, this developed. So episcopacy was in Great Britain and established very, very early on. So we have the Council of Rimini at 359. We know that British bishops were in attendance, and we also know archaeologically that Christianity made a significant impact because we see through archaeology all sorts of Christian symbols, even though they are sparse, there's a variety. And we also know that they are found, some of them were found in 360 in the chapel of Lullingstone in Kent, as well as Silchester and Hinnon at St. Mary's. So there is ample archaeological evidence of the iconography of Christianity in Great Britain. Now we get to everybody's favorite enemy, Pelagius. If Great Britain was going to be noted for anything, I can guarantee you they didn't want to be noted as the seedbed of Pelagius. The early church dealt with a lot of controversy and numerous heresies. As a matter of fact, it would not be outlandish to say that the majority of the early church councils were called in a response to some erroneous theological teaching. That's almost a truism to say that. Well, Pelagius is Great Britain's contribution to stupidity. He was a Romanized Briton. He was a monk. And by all accounts, he was brilliant. He was urbane. He was highly civilized. And around 380 AD, yeah, that's what I got up there, 380 AD, while he was a young man, he wound up leaving Great Britain, much to the joy of every Brit that was alive at the time, and never returned. He spent the rest of his days traveling around the Mediterranean, and he appears to have died in Syria, probably ducking St. Augustine the entire way, because he and St. Augustine they were Rocky and Apollo Creed. They were Muhammad Ali and George Foreman, or Joe Frazier. They were Rocky Marciano and Jersey. I mean, you can go through. They were arch enemies. They went at it hammer and tongue. And to the degree that Pelagius was brilliant, St. Augustine was double. Now, the interesting thing is this. St. Augustine effectively destroyed Pelagianism. The Council of Orange in 529, which we won't discuss, but the Council of Orange essentially sided with St. Augustine. The problem was, as in all of these types of situations, once you get past the original pronouncements and it starts to disseminate down, you get modifications. So while Pelagius was refuted by St. Augustine, Pelagius is, I guess you would call his child, arose, and that was semi-Pelagianism. And from probably the 7th century, probably the 600s, until this very day, the main report in Christianity is semi-Pelagianism. I'll tell you in just a second. Pelagius essentially thought that St. Augustine's teaching on grace was too hard, it was too rigid, it was devoid of the dignity of man. And it was essentially a denial of man's moral courage, or, as the theological discussion developed, it was a denial of man's ability. Now, what are we talking about? Well, Pelagius rejected the notion of original. There's a whole bunch of stuff that he taught, and I'm not going to go into. There's not going to be a course on Pelagianism, but the primary issue was he rejected original sin. He believed that every human being born has the moral ability. You need to memorize that phrase, moral ability, to be perfect, to choose to believe in God without any hindrance, without any effect of his will upon his ability to choose. St. Augustine argued that that is theologically incorrect. Why? Because when man fell, when Adam fell, not only was the sin of Adam as the representative of all of humanity passed on to Adam's progeny, but the guilt was passed on as well because he represented all of mankind. And at that point, if you will remember, the punishment that was pronounced on Adam by God was, in the day that you eat of the tree of the knowledge of good and evil, you will
Die.
You will die. Now, here's a question for you. What you're thinking. I gotta keep moving. I gotta get a better camera. Here's a question for you. Put your thinking caps on. Did Adam and Eve die?
No.
Yes.
No, they didn't. Later.
How many people say yes?
Later.
Very good. Go to the top of the class. The reason is this. Everybody thinks death means physical death. And it does. Because they started to physically die. But what actually occurred, well, not actually, but what more substantively occurred was their soul died. they lost their moral perfection. Remember, they were perfect in the garden. And when they sinned, that's what they lost. And what Augustine pointed out to Pelagius was that you cannot divorce their action from that result. They are intrinsically connected. So what was the result according to St. Augustine? The result according to St. Augustine was that God had to directly intervene. Do we see that in the Garden of Eden? Everybody nod your head and say yes. Father Paul, we see that in the Garden of Eden. Why? What is the indicator that it was God that directly intervened after the fall? Go ahead, Michelle.
Because they tried to cover up with leaves, and he made a blood sacrifice. He killed the lamb.
Okay, you actually got it, but you went a little further. No, you're right. You're on the right track. Because he went looking for them. It wasn't that he didn't know where they were. It's like, where are you guys? I can't see you. He wasn't playing hide and seek with them. He wanted them to take responsibility and to come forward. Where are you? Well, we knew we were naked, so we hid. You gotta love kids. They always give more information than you ask. I didn't tell you. I didn't tell you you were naked. How do you know? How do you know you were naked? Okay, so we can go through all that. But the fact of the matter is, St. Augustine pointed out, you can't separate those two. At the point in which Adam and Eve sinned and lost their moral perfection, they lost their ability to choose God without God first intervening. Michelle.
Okay, so basically Pelagius was saying you can make this choice apart from grace?
Yep.
Okay.
You don't need grace. Yep. And Augustine wrote, Mike, if you're going to say something, say it loud so we can all hear it.
You may have had the right, but you didn't have the ability.
There you go. And St. Augustine wrote volumes critiquing Pelagius. If you can look at any one of his writings, whether it's De Trinitate, it doesn't really matter, on free will, it does. In some sense, he's either directly or indirectly interacting with Pelagius. Okay, I don't want to beat that horse any longer. But to answer your question, semi-Pelagianism, which is the predominant view theologically today, states at the cross of Christ, the obstacle for men to choose Jesus was removed. What's the obstacle? What keeps us all from choosing Christ? Three letters, small word. Sounds like sin. Sin is what keeps us from the ability to choose Jesus, right? So according to the semi-Pelagian, when John 3:16 says, "For God so loved the world that he gave his only begotten Son," I won't read the rest of it, I won't quote the rest of it, but just that phrase alone, when it says that, what it means is that the death of Christ on the cross removes the obstacle, the original sin, let's put it that way, the original sin that keeps someone from believing and gives them the ability of their own will to choose to believe in God. What's the one major flaw in that argument? Remember, belief in God derives from the human will. That's where it comes from. You will to believe. What's the difficulty with that argument? There's one glaring problem. We are still fallen creatures. Original sin may have been removed, but the fact of the matter is we are still dead in our trespasses and sins. So, let me give you an illustration. I have the winning lottery ticket, $250 million. And I go to the nearest cemetery. And I take that lottery ticket and I put it right at the gates. And I say to the cemetery, any of you guys want the ticket, come get it. How many people are going to come and get it?
The workers.
Right?
I'm talking about those in the grave. How many people are going
Not
to?
any, zero.
Zero. God has to act as he acted with Adam and Eve in order for that to occur. So even with that particular semi-Pelagian argument, there's still major problems. Anyway, so from that, we have a number of people that are sent to Great Britain to try and undo what Pelagius had done. And this teaching, Pelagius' teaching, and this is only for those of you that are history wonks and want to pursue this further, Agricola, sounds like something you put on your salad. Agricola, in the 5th century, essentially, for lack of a better phrase, codified Pelagius' teaching in Great Britain. And the church was going, okay, no, we can't have this. We can't have this. So they send 2 emissaries. 2 emissaries are dispatched from France, where, of course, everybody is. And they were going to straighten this out. So they send Bishop Germanus. He was the bishop of Auxerre, Auxerre, Auxerre. And this poor guy must have suffered for his entire life. Bishop Lupus of Troyes. Man, oh man, this is a boy named Sue 10,000 years ago. Anyway, they arrived in Great Britain around 429. Somebody give me a time check.
9:49.
Okay, got a few minutes. So they arrived in Great Britain around 429 with the attempt to counter what Pelagius said. Germanus had been a Roman soldier. And because of the direct action of his prior bishop, he was consecrated. And he was one of those guys that when he walked into a room, everybody took a breath. He was an imposing individual. And I'm sorry, I have to laugh, because if you know the relationship between England and France later on in history, it probably doesn't derive from Germanus, but this was his assessment of British bishops. They were timid without self-confidence, so he organized them as a fighting force, and with wild yells of "Alleluia," he led them to victory over the marauding Picts, most likely near Mold in Flintshire. But his assessment of the British bishops when he showed up were that they were timid and they had no self-confidence. Typical of the French and British relationship, even today. So anyway, so they show up, and he wound up essentially kind of bucking up the British against the enemies, and did a decent job of kind of staving off both the Picts and the Pelagian heretics. But of course, that never lasts long. I'm going to skip ahead a little bit because this will get us to, all right. Now, if we go, as we're looking at this, we're primarily dealing with central to southern England. Now, if we go a little north, we see that there was a man up north who was doing really good work. Well, let's say he was doing effective work. And he was in the valleys of Cumberland and southern Scotland. And he was a very, very mild, very gentle Christian, and his name is Ninian. And he had studied, and he was involved with monasticism at the monastery of Saint Martin at Marmoutier. Okay? And he came to Britain apparently as a missionary. The date is a bit questionable, but he's usually assigned around 400 AD that he arrived in Great Britain. And he founded the monastery at Whithorn in Galloway, and it was built of stone that was ultimately whitewashed in order for it to be the most conspicuous object in the district. In other words, we are Christians, we are here, and we are going to set up this thing that when the sun hits it, it's going to glow throughout the region. And it came to be known as Candida Casa, the White House. And apparently he was involved with trying to evangelize the Picts, the Scots, and the Irish. And he did it near the Roman wall, he did it near Hadrian's Wall, and as well as the southern coast of Scotland. So there was a lot of evangelism taking place at this time. And Whithorn, the area, became the center of evangelism for quite a while. And one of its most famous members being Saint Kentigern, Kentigern, worked in Scotland, northern England, and Wales all the way into the early 6th century. And since we're running out of time, what I'm going to do right now is I'm going to stop because I'm going to mention one final name that will take us into next week, and that is Ninian was at work in Galway in the western region of England. He was the son of Calpurnius, a local administrator, or decurion, who was a deacon and the son of a priest. And he wound up interacting with a young man who was about 15 years old that we know as St. Patrick. So we will stop there. We'll pick up St. Patrick next week. And because I was asked a while back, we'll probably also talk a little bit about Celtic Christianity the week after, before we get into moving towards the real clash between Rome and British Christianity. Questions?
Are you saying Galway or Galloway? Where Ninian was?
Ninian was in, I'm probably mispronouncing. Yeah, Galloway.
But not the one in Ireland.
No. No, yes, that is the one in Ireland. Galloway. Yeah.
So he was in Ireland
And
and Wales. And
yeah, we are.
everything. Okay.
Yeah. Okay. Now it's you. Questions? Everybody got this?
No. I'm going to copy off. Go ahead.
Question? Anybody got any questions? No questions? I just don't like today. No, wow, okay, you guys really are.
Well, I do have a question, but it could take all day.
Well, that's not surprising.
I have always had
Well,
trouble
just-
with Pelagians.
It's all
Is that what we get
context.
for?
It's
Everybody has trouble with Pelagius except for Pelagius.
just kind of give us an idea.
What was the one thing?
I only mentioned one thing.
The moral ability to
Yeah.
be perfect, to choose to
Yeah.
believe in God.
Yeah.
He did not think we had that.
No, he believed that. That was his position. That we have the moral ability, that there is nothing that provides an obstacle for any human being to choose to believe in God. A sinful will, a sinful nature. St. Paul in Ephesians saying we are dead in our trespasses and sins. None of that, according to Pelagius, is an obstacle for any human being to believe in God. You wake up on Sunday morning and you say, you know what, I'm going to believe in God.
Because we have the ability.
Because according to Pelagius, we have the moral ability. This issue, which is still being fought today, this issue is the single core issue in the question of the nature of Christ's atonement. Moral ability. How does Christ's atonement relate to moral ability? So, when you guys figure all of that out, write a book and you'll be famous.
If it is given to us to know.
So you said semi-Pelagianism.
Yeah. Semi-Pelagian Go ahead, I'm sorry.
Well,
No.
it's a predominant theology today.
Yes, it
That's
is.
probably how we see it today.
I'm sorry?
How do we see it today?
How do we see what? Semi-Pelagianism?
Yeah.
Well, since it's the dominant theology, everybody
That's what
advocates it.
people believe.
Hmm?
People believe that.
Yeah, yeah. That is the predominant theological position today. Mhm.
Free will Baptist.
Yeah, that's free will. Lutheran, well, that's a different issue. Your general non-denominational evangelical free will Baptist, any Baptist for that, with the exception of the Reformed Baptist, any Baptist believes it. That's what is that's the rank and file, or Orthodox. Rome is semi-Pelagian, and now that's why I mentioned the Council of Orange in 529, because the Council of Orange came out and talked. They actually issued their decrees out of both sides of their mouth. On the one hand, they condemned Pelagianism, and then on the other hand, they tacitly endorsed semi-Pelagianism.
Where does that fit in with dispensationalism?
Hand in glove. Hand in glove.
Where do they go with judgment?
Who?
Pelagianism. Is that
Well, according to
Is it
Pelagius,
that
you
far?
have the ability to choose God. So, see, in his articulation of the relationship between man and God, if man has the moral ability to choose God, if there's nothing that blocks his chances to make a commitment to Christ, and goes through his entire life and never chooses Christ. See, in Pelagius' mind, that justifies God in sending man to judgment. That's how he viewed it. The problem that he has, of course, is, as we pointed out, is the nature of man's will, the nature of man's soul, which is fallen and it is alienated from God anyway. So, it's the question of whether or not God has the right to judge based on holiness and righteousness, or whether he must be forced to judge based upon the actions of the individual. Those are two different questions.
So how how do they even get by the verse where it is by grace you have been saved?
They believe, well, who, Pelagians?
Yeah, semi-Pelagians.
If you ask an actual Pelagian, they would simply say grace is. I want to make sure I phrase this carefully. Grace is a booster shot.
Okay?
Okay? Make sure you get vaxxed and then get your booster. Grace is the booster that helps your moral ability. But it does not, in and of itself, provide you the moral ability. See the difference?
So that's where it comes in. If you are sinful and bad all your life, and on your deathbed you say, I accept Jesus, then you can go to heaven.
If your commitment at that point, if your profession of faith at that point
And that's what the
is genuine, which means that God would have had to have acted in your heart. He would have had to take your heart of stone and make it a heart of flesh. If it is a genuine commitment to Christ, then yeah. I mean, look at the thief on the cross.
Yeah. Yeah. My mother used to quote that frequently.
Well, that's the most direct, and it's the simplest reference that speaks of God's acting in the life of the individual at the very last second. But we'll touch a little bit about that this morning in my sermon, just a little bit. We good?
There's popular legend, for lack of a better word, that Constantine was converted at York. Is that true?
Converted.
At York. There's a big statue of him outside the minster.
He was converted at the battle, allegedly converted at the Battle of the Milvian Bridge. So, I don't remember.
Baptized there.
I don't remember. I don't remember my geography, but I don't believe the Milvian Bridge was in Great Britain. I believe the Milvian Bridge was down somewhere in Tuscany, but I'm not sure. Don't quote me on that. But it was at the Milvian Bridge. He had a vision with this sign, "Go forward," and he put it on the shields of his men, and they went and they were victorious. He was baptized. He was baptized on his deathbed, so it wouldn't have been in York. He was baptized on his deathbed because at that time, the theological position of the church, for the most part, was that baptism was the removal of sin, and he did not want to risk being baptized, being cleansed, and then sin post-baptism, because he thought he would wind up being judged. So he waited until the very last. This is one of the ridiculous arguments you hear from atheists when they start talking about, well, Constantine was a pagan until his entire life. Constantine wasn't a pagan until his entire life. Constantine actually believed what the church taught, which was why he was scrupulous in paying attention to the doctrine of baptism. He truly was concerned with his spiritual well-being and his eternal life. So he waited until the very last minute. Thank God he had priests around him and a bishop around him. And he waited until the very last minute in order to be baptized, so that in his mind he would not run the risk of falling into sin and losing his chance for heaven.